The presentation of anarchism as social philosophy which aims at the emancipation, economic, social, political, and spiritual of the human race. The emancipation.
Anarchist Essays is brought to you by Loughborough University's Anarchism Research Group. For more information on the ARG, see the link in the show notes or follow us on Twitter at ARGLBORO.
Writing as Self-Construction, Leda Rafanelli's Life in Anarchism, Typography and Publishing by Roberta Cesana. When we talk about anarchism, we often focus on ideas, doctrines, or moments of political rupture. We reconstruct debates, theoretical trajectories, generational shifts, organizational forms, but anarchism has always also been a matter of practice, of everyday work, of the material conditions that allow ideas to circulate and movements to endure. Print culture, newspapers, pamphlets, books, has been one of the most durable material foundations of anarchist movements. Yet the labor that sustained this culture has often remained invisible, especially when it was women's labor. In this essay, I want to revisit the figure of Leda Rafanelli, born in 1880 and died in 1971. She's well known in anarchist historiography as a militant, a leading figure among the Milanese anarcho-individualists, a woman of strong personality and unconventional choices, but she has rarely been recognized for what she materially was, a typographer, publisher, bookseller, and organizer of editorial production. My argument is twofold. First, for Rafanelli, writing, printing, and publishing were not secondary to anarchist practice. They were anarchism in action. Second, through the acts of writing and publishing, she constructed and presented herself simultaneously as anarchist, intellectual, professional, and militant. Writing and publishing, in her case, functioned as a practice of identity, as a deliberate process of self-construction. This notion of self-construction is central to my reading. It does not refer simply to autobiographical narration. It refers to a broader process in which professional activity, political commitment, and textual production converge in the shaping of a public self. Rafanelli did not merely describe who she was. She made herself materially and symbolically through print. The history of printing and publishing has rarely dwelt on women typographers, and yet from the early modern period through the 19th and 20th centuries, women often played central roles in print workshops. They supervised production processes, managed finances, handled client relations, maintained editorial networks, and preserved symbolic capital built by families and firms over time. Often they exercised de facto authority without formal recognition. In some cases, especially after the death of a husband or father, they ensured the survival of workshops and presses while remaining absent from official accounts. This invisibility is structural. It reflects a broader marginalization of women's labor in cultural production, especially where manual and intellectual work intersect. In the historiography of anarchism, the biographical method has been particularly influential. Lives are reconstructed to illuminate movements. Individual trajectories become lenses through which collective histories are understood. This is especially true in anarchist studies, where individual experience often compensates for the non-systematic and fragmented character of organizations and associations. Yet even within this biographical tradition, professional labor, especially women's professional labor, often remains secondary to ideological or emotional narratives. Rafanelli's life makes this mechanism visible. She co-founded several publishing houses central to anarchist publishing and known not only for political texts but also for ambitious editorial initiatives, including the first Italian edition of Nietzsche's complete works and early translations of authors such as Jack London, Aldous Huxley, and P.G. Wodehouse. And yet these enterprises are still commonly remembered under the names of Luigi Poli, her husband, or Giuseppe Monani, her later companion. Recovering Rafanelli as a publisher does not simply mean restoring credit to an overlooked collaborator. It means questioning how historiography assigns authorship and entrepreneurial identity. It means recognizing anarchist publishing as a field of gendered labor in which women's professionalism was decisive, yet often obscured. It also means recognizing that professional identity and political identity were, in her case, inseparable. Rafanelli's relationship with print began at 14 when she entered a print shop in Pistoia as an apprentice. In her later autobiographical writing, she reconstructs this moment as foundational. She recalls being moved from manual tasks to the typecase, becoming a compositor. She describes reading proofs, searching discarded sheets for articles to read, especially when fragments came from socialist newspapers, and she writes, "Oh, the printed paper, it has filled, oriented my whole life." The print shop was not merely a workplace. It was a space of reading, of exchange, of political discovery. Socialist newspapers were occasionally printed there, sometimes seized. Anarchist ideas circulated materially through paper and ink. In one remembered scene, a co-worker named Alfredo hands her anarchist newspapers and invites her to read them. The episode culminates in a gesture of self-recognition. The young Rafanelli, filled with emotion, cries out, "Long live Gaetano Bresci!" That moment is narrated not simply as a youthful enthusiasm, but as the symbolic discovery of political belonging. Her discovery of anarchism is inseparable from her discovery of typography. The print shop becomes, in her memory, a school of anarchism, but what is important methodologically is that this reconstruction is retrospective. It is written decades later. It is part of a narrative project. She is not simply remembering, she is interpreting, she is constructing continuity between adolescence, professional training, and political identity. The print shop becomes the origin story of a coherent self. If the print shop formed her politically, writing became the space where that formation was articulated and stabilized. Rafanelli's literary production is far more extensive than is often assumed. During her life, she published 15 novels, one of them translated into Spanish, around 50 short stories, and hundreds of articles in newspapers and magazines. In addition, her archive preserves dozens of unpublished novels, hundreds of short stories, poems, prose pieces, fragments of autobiography and biography. Much of this material is autobiographical or semi-autobiographical. It blends history, memory, propaganda, narrative, and self-representation. I refer to these materials as sources of the self. They allow us to observe not only what she experienced, but how she chose to represent those experiences. Writing, in her case, was not confession. It was positioning. It was a way of presenting herself as anarchist militant, professional typographer, intellectual woman, political individualist, organizer of networks. And crucially, many of her works were self-published by the presses she co-founded. This is where the concept of self-construction becomes materially grounded. Self-construction here is not purely textual. To write was already to prepare for print. To publish was to intervene directly in anarchist culture. To control production was to control representation. As she later recalled, "We were in the printing house where our newspaper was printed. It was truly ours because it was written, composed, and printed by us." Written, composed, printed. The integration of intellectual and manual labor was constitutive of her political identity. She did not separate thought from production. This tension between life, politics, and self-representation also appears in the contradictions that have long attracted critical attention. Rafanelli was both anarchist and Muslim, having converted to Islam at the beginning of the 20th century and remaining faithful to that choice throughout her life, making it visible in dress, jewelry, domestic space, and self-presentation. At the same time, she distanced herself verbally from feminism while living in ways that anticipated many feminist claims: economic independence, erotic autonomy, intellectual authority, and refusal of conventional womanhood. These tensions do not weaken her self-construction, they are part of it. They show a woman actively producing an identity that was nonconformist in political, religious, and gendered terms all at once. Together with Giuseppe Monani, Rafanelli founded a publishing house in Milan, complete with its own print works. They published newspapers, they produced pamphlets against clericalism, militarism, and the school system. They printed books on social culture. The bookshop and print shop also became a meeting place for figures in Milan's subversive and artistic circles in the years before the First World War. What emerges repeatedly in Rafanelli's recollections is insistence on work. Publishing required paper, machines, wages, rent, postage. It required constant effort. In the autobiographical novel entitled Leda Rafanelli Carlo Cara, she states plainly, "I worked and earned a lot, while my companion, working only for the newspaper, had very little money. The economic survival of the publishing house depended largely on her paid work as a typographer elsewhere, and on the fact that both she and Monani could personally compose and print texts. Here again, professional labor and political commitment intersect. This was not romantic militancy, it was material strategy. Anarchist publishing was sustained by labor, and often invisible labor. And it is precisely this labor that has been marginalized in historical narratives. One episode in Rafanelli's life makes this conception of labor and legitimacy particularly clear. In 1913 and 1914, she was involved in an intense personal and intellectual relationship with Benito Mussolini, who, at the time, was still a socialist and editor of Avanti. Their correspondence would later be published by Rafanelli in Una donna e Mussolini, framed not as scandal, but as political testimony. What is striking in her retrospective account is not intimacy, but work. She recalls visiting the offices of Avanti and observing the environment of a large, centralized daily newspaper. The scale was impressive, the machinery more developed, the organization more hierarchical, yet what she perceived was a distance from the material process of production. In contrast, she describes the anarchist press she ran with Monani in uncompromisingly concrete terms. "We really work for our newspaper. We write it, we typeset it, we lay it out, we print it with our small machine, and we do the shipping." For Rafanelli, legitimacy did not derive from directing a large newspaper or occupying a central editorial role. It derived from participation in the entire chain of production, writing, composition, printing, distribution. These were not secondary tasks. They were the substance of anarchist autonomy. In Rafanelli's memory, the print shop appears not only as a site of production, but as a space of encounter. It is a meeting point for militants, writers, artists, organizers. Publishing here is not neutral mediation. It is connective tissue. It sustains relationships. It preserves continuity. It produces a shared political culture. From this perspective, Rafanelli was not simply an author within anarchist networks. She was an organizer of their material basis. In the later decades of her life, Rafanelli turned increasingly to memory and autobiography. Her archive is heterogeneous and fragmentary. Annotated books, unpublished manuscripts, letters, photographs, newspaper clippings, political writings, remnants of a personal library, often marked by her own annotations, sometimes in Arabic. This irregularity mirrors her self-definition. In one text she writes, "I am an irregular even in my memories." Autobiography becomes here a political act. It becomes what we might call an archival will, a deliberate attempt to shape how one will be remembered. In one of her last unpublished texts, written through the fictional voice of her granddaughter, Rafanelli even stages the transmission of her papers and memory to the next generation. Through memory, she reclaims professional labor that had been obscured. Through narrative, she stabilizes a self that had been marginalized. Self-construction, here, extends beyond life into archival survival. Over a life spanning much of the 20th century, Leda Rafanelli merged political commitment with professional autonomy and economic independence, rare for a woman of her time. She did not only write anarchism, she printed it, she distributed it, she organized its circulation. Through writing and publishing, she constructed a precise representation of herself, at once professional and political. To recover Rafanelli as a publisher is not merely to correct an omission, it is to recognize that anarchism has always depended on material practices, on hand-setting type, on presses maintained, on wages earned and reinvested. Rafanelli reminds us that anarchism is made materially, collectively, and often invisibly, and that making, that labor of construction, was also for her the making of herself.
Thank you for listening. To help others find anarchist essays, please rate and review us wherever you find your podcasts. And if you're interested in anarchist ideas, why not check out the journal Anarchist Studies? For over 20 years, Anarchist Studies has been publishing original research on the history, theory, and practice of anarchism. For more information, visit www.lwbooks.co.uk/anarchist-studies.